Hello, everyone. Welcome to the FTX podcast. Today, an episode with the man who needs no introduction, SBF. Sam, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you on. I think it's been about 9 months since the last one, and this is actually the 3 of 3 series that we started 2 years ago. So exciting moment.
Boy, that seems like so long ago.
Yeah, it's been quite a bit. And what I want to kick off with is sort of what has your focus been over the last 9 months?
I mean, the answer is clearly regulatory. And, I've spent the bulk of it trying to figure out, what the regulatory framework for crypto is going to be globally, what it's going to be in the United States, and, what we need to do as a company to be as regulated as possible, to be as licensed, as possible. And some part of that is figuring out which laws there are to comply with. Some part of that is figuring out which laws are yet to be written, but we should be helping out with. And part of that is figuring out what compliance means, in some jurisdictions in the absence of clarity.
Hmm. And why? Like, why is this a worthy goal, I guess, is a question for me.
Yeah, there are a few pieces to it. And one piece of this is just like, it is what it is. And, for better or for worse, like that's the direction that everything is moving in and that everything is going to move in the crypto ecosystem. Regulators are getting more and more engaged and, going to treat it as a regulated financial system, similar to other systems in some ways. But, another piece is, and you can see this from the downfalls of, of Celsius and Voyager, you can see this from, the issues with Terra Luna, that there are actually a lot of areas where more consumer protection, more consumer education would be really helpful, where there actually are, I think, a lot of gains to be had from providing clarity that hasn't historically been there for users. And, I think that, well-written regulation, should help give people that clarity, that peace of mind, and that protection.
Hmm. And I remember maybe a year ago, we were doing a Twitter Spaces and sort of talking about the different approach that different jurisdictions took to the regulatory perspective on crypto. Has it continued to be this disparate motion across different countries where you have to sort of stay updated across everything, or is there more communication, more coordination now?
There's sorts of coordination and communication, but it is still pretty disparate. Like it is still the case that we separately have communication with the JSA on our Japanese licensed product, with the SEC on security tokens, with the CFTC on commodity token futures, and sort of on and on and on. And so we're still seeing mostly a piecemeal approach taken by the world here. I do think probably that will change on the time scale of of years, but at least for now, there's a little bit of every country for themselves.
Got it. And I'm assuming that priority is mostly, well, of course, you're getting licenses across the board, but the priority is the United States because of the CFTC application. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's mostly right. And, I think it's also worth noting that the entire world does watch what the United States does. Like the entire world is taking cues from the US regulatory decisions. And, it's seen as, or at least expected to be sort of the leader on financial regulation. And so I think that no matter what happens in the US will have broader implications. But also, we're applying with the CFTC to launch margin futures products, through them in the United States. We're talking with the SEC about what security tokens will look like, and so we do also just in fact have a lot of open lines of communication right now with U.S. regulators, and it's certainly the biggest push and the most intense push. It's not a sort of lightweight thing, but the what I hope is generally going to be true, and what we have seen being true in a lot of circumstances, is the U.S. regulators taking a healthy approach to crypto regulation in general. And what I mean by that is, the narrative that people talk about the most is around more versus less regulation. It's around should crypto be more regulated than it is today? So how much more regulated? And I think that's mostly the wrong frame. I think the right frame is what should the regulation be? Is rather than making the primary focal point how much regulation there is, the primary focal point should be what are the things that it's important to regulate, and how can we make sure that we get regulation in those areas. And I think that having basic oversight of the venues makes a ton of sense. Having disclosures and registration transparency around the assets makes a ton of sense. And I think that I'm optimistic that's the direction we're going in. But it also means that it's really important for us and others to be engaged in the process, that we can make sure to be highlighting, to policymakers and regulators which areas there are that sort of most need attention.
Mm-hmm. And I know you've spent hundreds, if not thousands, of hours. A lot of that has been focused on this margin and futures unlock here in the United States. I'd love to hear a little bit about what this really means, because I know it actually changes margin in general across the board, right?
It's a super interesting topic, and I do think that ultimately it's going to be pretty impactful in terms of what market structure looks like. What it does is it sort of turns on its head notions about where margin is calculated and where it's enforced in at least in the United States. Now, it's worth noting that a lot of other jurisdictions are already there, right? Like Germany recently, I think BaFin recently released a sort of comment period or something for a statement around, should we just ban other forms of margin except for the one that is very similar to what we're proposing in the United States. So this is, there are a lot of places where this is already how it works. But high level, what it does is it says, all right, instead of thinking of this as, instead of thinking of margin as a sort of series of credit agreements between a lot of entities and intermediaries, thinking of margin as collateral posted with a clearinghouse. And so, if Bob wants to put on a position on FTX US derivatives, similar to how it works on FTX International, Bob has to go deposit collateral to FTX, to the clearinghouse to start with. And then that's the amount of margin that they have, or the amount of collateral that they have. And, the position size that they can put on is based on that amount of collateral, rather than being based on a guess of, how credit worthy they're going to be, rather than being based on, a guess about what what would be the sort of like standard thing to do there or something. Instead, the standard is, well, Bob has what he has, and let's just calculate that, and that way, the most Bob can lose is what he's deposited to the platform. It's there ahead of time, so you don't have to worry that it was all fictitious in the first place. And there are clear guidelines around exactly how big of a position and Bob can put on, and at what point there would need to be margin called, because it's just based on the amount of collateral they have already deposited to the platform. And so I think in a lot of ways, it's a more straightforward system than the sort of traditional credit-based ones.
It also removes this obstacle of like hours that are closed and weekends and whatnot, because it becomes more programmatic. Is that right?
That's right. Like, FTX is a 24/7 marketplace, and that helps a lot in terms of not having giant gap moves over weekends, overnights. It also means that what you have with FTX is a platform where on Saturday it's still computing margin. It doesn't sort of forget about risk on weekends, and people talk about gap risk over during or risk of market movement during weekends for a 24/7 platform, but I think that's sort of not the right way to think about it. Like, risk always exists during weekends. It's not like, by closing down the platform, the world can't change. You're just sort of pretending it doesn't exist. You're just forgetting about it. And, by operating on weekends, we're just making that explicit, that, that risk still exists, that, you still have to think about how to margin.
And like a system like this would have avoided, for example, what happened with nickel 6-8 months ago, right?
Yeah, exactly. Where, by the time it sort of became clear what was going on, they were already too far underwater. And, that's not what you want. You want there to be clarity ahead of time, and you don't want all of the customers on a platform to be exposed to the risk management of all of the other customers on a platform. That's how you get contagion. And instead, what we do is you say, look, if you want to extend credit bilaterally to a particular customer because you trust them, you can do that as a third party. But we're going to ask for that collateral one way or another to make sure that the rest of the platform has a guarantee there.
And would you say that this is inspired off of crypto in a sense, that by seeing the models that worked in crypto, now we're able to improve the traditional finance models?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of this is modeled based on how crypto exchanges have worked, and we've put a lot of thought into that, into reforming some parts of how crypto exchanges operate, because there were some parts of it that I think were pretty irresponsible 4 years ago. But at this point, I think that the high level structure of the venues in crypto is actually pretty thoughtful, and is actually a pretty healthy take on risk management. And so that was absolutely a sort of roadmap for how we thought about this. And we think about this in terms of what can we do to provide clarity and transparency to the system to make sure that there's that people are exposed to what they think they're exposed to and not to a bunch of other extraneous things. And so far I think it's worked pretty well, all things considered.
You've been speaking a lot with regulators and all these different people who have a say in creating these systems and allowing them to become sort of the mainstay in the United States. What is it like? What are these conversations like? How do you move in a productive manner forward? Like, what is needed? Is it mostly education? What's the mainstay here?
It's a good question. And frankly, I've been pretty pleasantly surprised by the answer to it. Which is to say that, by and large, there are a lot of people who are just trying to figure out how to do the right thing here. A lot of policymakers, a lot of lawmakers, regulators who are just looking at this in terms of, how should we be viewing regulation of crypto? What are the important things to provide oversight for, and how do we do that? And what is the the appropriate way to do risk management? What's the appropriate way to protect customers? It's been surprisingly productive conversations, which means that a lot of it has just been around education, been around communication, and just making sure everyone's on the same page, and sort of aware of what the important factors are here. Anyway, it was not sort of like obvious to me a priori that was going to be how this would work. Like, I definitely, a lot of me felt like it was going to end up being a much more messy, politically driven exercise. But when push comes to shove, I've been pretty happy, frankly, with how regulation has turned out, and with how constructive people have been about it.
That leads to my next question, which is we usually see politicians and regulators through the media, through the television, never on a personal level. And you've been interacting with a lot of them on a personal level. At the end of the day, they're just people, right? Trying to figure out what they're doing, and you need to reach them at that level. Of have you felt that they're not normal people?
In many ways they are. And in many ways, these conversations, they're conversations, the way that most conversations are, where, there's a back and a forth, and, you're talking, collaboratively about, what's the ecosystem like? What should we be doing? What could we be doing on it? And so in many ways, it has actually just been super healthy. The ways in which it's been a little bit different than that, and there have been some ways in which it has, I think that, like, it is certainly the case that they are in the end they're people, but if you touch on hot button topics, there's a lot going on there, right? Like, obviously, if this were abortion that we were talking about here, like, they wouldn't be normal person conversations. These are people who have so many pressures on them in so many directions on politicized topics. And so you have to either stay away from hot button political topics, or accept that it's going to be a little bit of a stilted conversation in some ways. But the good thing about crypto is that it's mostly managed to avoid becoming super political. It's mostly managed to remain a bipartisan issue where people are thinking about the facts, and that's been super, super valuable.
Why do you think that is?
Don't know for sure. I mean, I wish I knew better than I did, because it's really good for the world that is the case. I'm super thankful for it. But it's also not something that I sort of quote unquote feel like we deserve or something. And I think we got a little bit lucky that it just wasn't completely obvious what the political alignment of crypto was going to be. And when I say that, if you think about it, like, who are crypto users, right? They're actually a bit of a motley crew in some ways, right? Like, they sort of like, you could describe them as like left libertarian in some ways. I don't know, but like both the far left and the far right are overrepresented in crypto. Both people who will eat only meat and people who do not eat any meat are overrepresented in crypto, right? People who are tech focused are like Silicon Valley is overrepresented, rural areas are overrepresented. And what you get is this sort of like weird combination of, like, on the one hand, people who are who are sort of like technologically savvy and forward, so to speak, and on the other hand, you also at the same time, you have people who have really bad access to the financial ecosystem and are looking for something better. Both of those, find appealing crypto. And so at the end of the day, I think the fact that it's hard to succinctly define who is a crypto user is actually kind of good, and has meant that it has mostly been able to dodge political partisan lines and stay more in the realm of, what should this be?
Mm-hmm. And has it clicked with the people that you're speaking with that the majority of derivatives volume is offshore, and if this were opened up in the United States, then all that opportunity would exist here?
I think that clicks really quickly, and I think that's one of the clearest things for people, when they hear it, for why we need to do something here, because that's not what anyone wants. Like, no one thinks that the way they should work is that it should be offshore, sketchy, unregulated. That's not anyone's goal. And so because of that, I do think there's been a lot of sort of recognition of the extent to which, in the end, this isn't the right long-term answer. We have to find something better eventually, one way or another. And I do think that's been helpful as well.
Mm-hmm. This is a bit of a pivot, but you've been somewhat more quiet on Twitter for a while now. But I have a general question around Twitter, and it's, how do you think about using Twitter? Like, how have you been able to maximize Twitter as a productive thing rather than a distraction?
I mean, certainly a little bit of a distraction. I won't claim it's not at all. But you know, I think that a big piece of this is, I skim through it pretty quickly. I don't spend enormous amounts of time and concentration thinking through every piece of it. I try to mitigate the extent to which it's clearly just being a distraction. But when I use Twitter, I think of it as one of the primary ways that I communicate with people, certainly, and that I communicate things to the world. And so part of this is, if I have to communicate things anyway, I might as well do it through Twitter. But part of it as well is a recognition of the fact that that this actually helps me think sometimes. Like, it really is the case that, like, by posting my thoughts on Twitter, I'm sort of forcing myself in some way to get them collected and to sort of, to get internal clarity on what exactly it is I think. And that's actually pretty helpful, I think. And so that's been a part of this, which has been, been pretty valuable for me to be able to do. And I think that, like, I get a lot from being forced to write my thoughts down.
Mm.
In terms of being less active, like I certainly have been, and some of this, frankly, is I have to make sure at this point that that things I'm posting are inoffensive to a very wide group of people. That's not ideal. It's not where I would sort of ideally want to be, but it's sort of where I am, and I've accepted that to some extent. But I'm sort of optimistic over time that I'll be able to get more, a bit more freedom on, how I use Twitter and how I communicate in general. That there will be fewer pressures on it, fewer, fewer constraints. But yeah, I do think that's definitely been a big piece of it.
And how do you think FTX is communicating now? Are you still thinking of it from the perspective of we essentially need to speak to a mass consumer audience? We need to let them know that we're here, that we're creating this application where they can have access to all their financial services? Or has your mental model updated a little bit on that?
It's simply the case that like we are speaking to a mass audience here, and it's a pretty diverse one, in basically any sense of the word, and that definitely complicates it. It makes it a non-trivial group to talk to, but but I think that a lot of what we have to say is somewhat universal in the first place, which helps. Like a lot of the things that I end up wanting to communicate, I feel like actually are pretty I feel kind of okay with the fact that they have to be mass communicated, because I feel in the end that that is actually how they're meant to be in some ways. That these are things which are which make a lot of sense when communicated more broadly, and so it's been, I think, something of a learning experience, figuring out, as always, when you have a lot of stakeholders for communication, how to balance all of that out. But it's been a fun and useful learning experience.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one thing I'm curious as well is with all this communication to the mass user audience, I'm sure that what recently happened with Celsius and a lot of these other lending platforms has actually sort of hurt this market that we would wish to bring in a healthy way to the space. How has this activity sort of been for you? Have you had to be super involved? I know there's been a lot of sort of like financial activity, but what's the story been?
Yeah. Oh, certainly. Like I've been fairly involved in the various bailouts going on, and I've had to be. I haven't been the one um who is taking the biggest lead on it, but I've certainly been, had everything run by me, and been engaged with it. It's definitely been a stressful period for everyone in the ecosystem, and I think especially for the users, and that sucks. That is never what you want to see. It certainly set things back a bit. I think on the regulatory side, I think it just underscores what sort of the momentum has been pushing for a while anyway, which is to say regulatory oversight and clarity. And I think if anything, sort of made it more clear that that was necessary. But uh but it's been a tightrope walk for the space, and similarly for us as we evaluate a number of the places that have financial hardship right now, and trying to understand where do we want to try to jump in and provide financing, and how do we do that. That's a little bit of a tightrope walk as well, in terms of finding places where we can have real impact, where it's really necessary, but where we're also going to be able to be successful in bailing them out.
Hmm. And across all of these different platforms, what we saw was just mass contagion. It was crazy. Everything was linked to each other, and it just kind of snowballed all the way down. What are some ways that you're thinking that these systems could still be in place? You could have healthy lending markets, but without these contagion aspects that we've seen?
I think that, like, one thing worth noting is when you look at the decentralized versions of these, they actually didn't have big problems during the most recent crash. And the reason is that there was transparency on what assets were backing which loans. And and that helped a lot. And so I think having some amount of regulatory oversight of the asset to to loan ratios here, would help make sure that the lending platforms are operating in a responsible manner. And I think some of these problems have been brewing for quite a while before they actually ultimately surfaced. And so I think that just having that oversight and transparency, I do think actually would have gone a pretty long way here towards helping. Outside of that, I think just sort of, getting to a position as a space where there is regulatory clarity for those who are looking for it, where there are clearly, clear ways to register products will help a lot, because, right now, if it's not even clear how to register, then you're going to get a lot of unregulated products with no oversight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm gonna do a big switch of pace here and go into more, I guess, personal line of questioning and to learn a little bit more about how you've been doing. And one of these questions is you seem to be sort of upgrading the arena. You're working in larger and larger arenas as time goes by. And I'd be curious like what the biggest changes have been for you in your life.
I mean, it's changed work a fair bit. It hasn't changed my life outside of work that much. I try, to have it not affect my sort of day-to-day life very much, and I think I mostly succeed. It's it means that I get recognized sometimes. Some places it's not ubiquitous yet, but it definitely happens. And it means that probably the biggest impact personally on me is that everything I do, I do have to now run through a filter of, is there going to be public visibility, on this, and what will that mean? Do I have to change what I'm going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think people are going to be watching it. And I think sometimes, sometimes the answer there is yes. Obviously with anything I say in public, I have to be careful. With my personal life, if anytime that I do something, there is some chance that that's going to end up in a newspaper, and I have to be cognizant of that fact. And that's true in terms of obviously statements I make. It's true in terms of where I live. It's true if I date someone. It's true if anything that I do. That there has to be a PR filter on this now, and that's a little bit a little invasive. So it's certainly a little weird and new, but outside of that, it hasn't changed my sort of day-to-day life that much, and I try and keep it that way. It certainly has meant that I've spent more time on the work side, thinking from a higher level about what's going on in with us and in the ecosystem. And in some ways that sort of is empowering and awesome. In some ways, I think it's been a bit of a downside too, though. I think it's probably led me to spend less time than I should focusing on product, on just sort of the day-to-day goings on. And I think that's a mistake. And I've started refocusing more on product, and it's something I think I should have been doing the whole time. But it's easy to get swept up in thinking about what the general regulatory infrastructure that various countries should be using is, and not enough about where some buttons should be on a website. And that's certainly something I've had to sort of refocus on.
Yeah, for the listeners, Sam gives probably some of the best user feedback for the devs on FTX. One other thing I imagine with getting known and out on the stage is that more and more people want things from you. I'm sure that more interactions that you have are people that are seeking something from you. How have you been able to filter that? How are you able to keep a goodwill perspective when speaking to people after having so many people always wanting stuff?
I mean, it's a little tough, and I don't necessarily think I do a perfect job of managing it. It makes it a little hard to figure out when people are sincere and when they're not, and what people's real thoughts are. And um, I I try as much as I can to emphasize to people that in the long run, trying to play games on this isn't going to work. That I'm going to be cognizant of what's going on. And it's, in the end, like, it's just gonna backfire to, try to be insincere about, um, what the right things to do are, but it's a constant struggle. I mean, it's something that I do have to be always thinking about is like, where is this coming from? Like, this person has a request of me. Like, is this coming because it's important that I do what they're thinking, or is this coming because they have an ulterior motive here? And if so, what do I do about that fact? And I don't have a perfect answer for that, but
Mhm.
it's something I think about a lot, and something that that something I have to think about, and something that puts some distance, I think, between me and other people. And I sort of regret that, but it is true that with almost everyone, whenever they say something to me, even friends sometimes, like I have to think in the back of my mind, what's going on there, and
Mhm.
like, is this a straightforward comment or thought or question, or is this somehow uh is there some side thing they're trying to maximize for that I should be aware of?
Yeah. I mean, luckily you have really high compute, so I'm sure you're able to process faster than most. Because it'd be a shame if you have to end up in a state where you just can't be open with anyone ever because of this.
It's definitely a worry, and I'm certainly not that extreme. Certainly isn't true of me, but less extreme version of this where like I am on average a bit less open than I otherwise would be,
Mhm.
probably is true. That like, this is a consideration I have to keep in mind. And that means that like, I am a little bit more reticent in almost all cases than I otherwise would be.
Mhm. And one thing that I think is definitely a superpower that you have is that you've been able to surround yourself with really good people from early on, and it's like part of the reason FTX was so successful. I'm going to go back and I'm going to kind of take this through time, but I'm actually curious. Early on, when you were roommates with Gary, what was your intuition that made you say this guy is the guy I want as my co-founder? I want to build with him. How did that come to be?
It's a good question. I mean, I was at the time, not thinking about much. It sort of like came a little bit out of nowhere for me, but I, but I think I didn't realize until, years later that, it made sense to think um, of a lot of the, relationships that I built on a much higher scale than I had been. Um, but but there's a sort of sense of like, combination of like someone who's really sharp, who just gets it, whatever it is, who sort of, you know, I can just communicate things, they'll grok it really quickly, they'll be able to see what my train of thought is and, be able to complete it. And be able to expand it on their own and to generate ideas on their own. And rather than sort of like writing up a Google Doc of this is what needs to happen, just saying like, wouldn't it be cool if we had a futures exchange? And they could be like, yeah, that would be cool. Let me go make one, you know? And so that certainly is like a piece of it. Um, but I think another piece of this is who I really feel comfortable and trust working with, and know that it's I know that things are going to work straightforwardly. That when I communicate, they'll understand. When they communicate, I'll understand. That everyone's just shooting straightforwardly for figuring out what the right thing to do is and doing it. And a lot of things which I think get underestimated often. But having that trust is just so important. It's so central and crucial.
Mhm.
And if you don't have it, you end up in just a much worse situation. And so finding people with whom you have that trust, I think is just absolutely key.
And that leads to my next question, which is a lot of your A team and like executives are people that you've known for a really long time. They're really good friends of yours. You've been through a lot with them. How do you balance like the friendship and the management component to make sure that stays healthy on a professional and a friendship level?
Tough. It is tough, and I think that we have this. What I try to do, and this is never perfect. And there's always there's always going to be some tension there. But, you know, but I think that like, you know, a high level, the thing that I guess like we try and balance is like, on the one hand, in the end, we need to do what's right for the company. You know, that sort of is the overarching answer. And, you know, one way or another, we have to get there. We have to always be thinking about that and optimizing for it. And that's a big piece of it. We have to be aligned on that. And you know, that means putting that ahead of the friendship, if that's what's necessary. On the other hand, you know, hopefully and ideally, what it means also is that, you know, we have trust that isn't super sensitive to that.
Mm.
That you know, we trust that, you know, we will be able to work together and do the right thing one way or another. Um, and that's not like a super contingent statement. That's not like a statement which is like dependent on, you know, the exact, you know, realities on the ground of exactly what's happening or something like that. That, you know, we just trust that you know, that we will be able to work constructively together, and that, you know, what each of us are doing, we're doing it the right thing for the right reasons, or at least doing a thing for the right reasons, and hopefully it's the right thing. Um, I, but you know, having that level of trust built in, I think is, it can be super valuable. The, you know, sense of like, we will do what's right for work at the end of the day, but also that, you know, we trust that we're going to do that, and that, you know, what we say is what we actually believe, and not some game.
Do you think this is part of why FTX has been able to stay so lean? I mean, we're an order of magnitude at least leaner than the people our size out there. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's definitely a piece of it, and I think that like, you know, having an environment where we trust each other is unbelievably important. And you know, so many things just don't work if you don't have that trust in ways that you might not predict, but that then being like super important. And so, you know, being able to trust that, you know, each of us are doing the right thing, and that, you know, we can trust what we say, that there's no you know, that there isn't internal deception. You know, without that, things actually degrade quite quickly. And so I think that's been a really important part of what's allowed us, to be able to get a lot more out of people. And I think that that's, you know, a big reason that we have tried so hard to stay lean, is just knowing that like, you know, that like, if we do this, if we, you know, keep a focus on you know, having people who are super aligned and trustworthy internally, that, you know, we will be able to move so much faster, because we'll be able to avoid getting bogged down in stupid shit. You know, we'll be able to avoid getting bogged down in arguments that never should have happened, um, that are clearly just ego based. And so I think that like, that has been a bit of a superpower. And and you know, it's one of the reasons that I'm most nervous about growing too quickly, is I'm just really nervous about, you know, ending up in a world where we've hired a lot of people who we don't fully trust, who, you know, we are worried about the alignment of, and now all of a sudden, you know, some recommendation comes in from some area of the business of like, hey, you know, we should pursue this initiative. And, you know, what do we do then? Like, is our first instinct like, oh boy, I don't know about that. Like, you know, it came from that area, and everyone knows that when something comes from that area, you can't trust it, right? Like, that's what I'm really terrified of.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also, you avoid hiring the people who are there to be checks and balances for other people. It's
Right.
such a mess.
Exactly. That's sort of managers hiring managers type thing, where, you know, you trace it all down to the end, and no one can figure out why anyone was, you know, why most of the people there are actually there. None of it makes any sense. And the answers are they're all there to govern each other. Like, you don't trust any of them. And so you hire a lot of people to monitor the other people that you hired. Like, you never want to end up there.
And I think like pretty early on, a lot of the inspiration for sort of the management model was from Jane Street because you had seen how it worked so well. Are there any things that you would denote as key differences that FTX does than you were doing at your time at Jane Street?
I mean, certainly, a lot of it is, to some extent based off of, what seemed to work well there. Um, in terms of differences, like uh we have, as the customer facing product, we have a
Mm,
much bigger emphasis on some areas than they did, right? Like when you look at a quant trading firm, sure, you have the quants, you have the devs, and you have some back office, you have some compliance, but most of it, frankly, is quants and devs really at the end of the day. When you look at us as a customer facing product, like um uh, we have a lot of people devoted to customer support, to know your customer, compliance, regulation, like huge areas of the business that are much more central to it than they were to a proprietary trading firm. So if nothing else, it just, the sort of firm composition looks a bit different. And then outside of that, like it's uh I think that means um that we need to manage internally a little bit differently because less of what we do is sort of quantitative analysis and real time decision making based on that, and more of what we do is trying to build good systems and good products and take feedback. And that means that there's a lot more communication between different groups rather than just internally within groups. And that a lot more of this is about trying to have people who are really engaging with the outside world and with what people think and want, with what our customers think and want, with what our regulators think and want, rather than most of the focus being on what our internal what's useful for us internally.
mhm. What do you think the hardest problem you've ever solved is?
Boy. So I'll maybe talk about yeah, what's the hardest problem? I mean, I can tell you what was the hardest problem for me, and I don't think this was, in some senses, this was not objectively the hardest problem. But it's what gave me the most trouble. This is very early on. This was, um, this was, kind of early mid 2018, and we had an internal fracture. And there were sort of disagreements over what path to take. Um, I sort of was on one side. I had different views than what some other people had. Everyone was getting sort of frustrated with each other, and I didn't know what to do. Like I fundamentally didn't know what to do when things were bad. I knew what to do, or at least somewhat knew what to do when things were good. But whenever trouble started brewing internally, I just sort of threw up my hands and said, I don't get it. I think X is right. I think I've given a good argument for it. People don't agree. I don't know what to do next. And it took me a few months to have any sort of plan or strategy for how to manage that. And ultimately it was a really hard and grueling period, for the company. Um, and yeah, that was a kind of brutal period. And I think I learned a lot about how to manage, and specifically about how to manage when things are bad. How to manage when nothing is working the way you want it to, when people don't like each other internally, when people disagree with you, when you disagree with people. Um, uh, but it's a very different skill, I think, than managing when things are good, which is mostly about encouragement, and positive feedback and priorities lists and, staying vigilant and things like that. Managing when things are bad is a lot more about some combination of empathy, on one hand, and on the other hand, knowing when you have to just sort of take control and say, hey, look, I understand people are going to, some people disagree with this decision, but we have to make a call as a company. It's what I think is right, and it is what it is. And and frankly, if this is a sticking point for you, if you can't get yourself comfortable with being in a place that's made this decision, then maybe this isn't the company for you. And that was not my lexicon, sort of prior to that happening. So that was probably the hardest. What was the hardest for me to to manage, and the hardest thing for me to come to terms with and to kind of learn and understand what to do about. There are a lot of other things, and I think I put regulation in this category, where I think from the outside and probably from my perspective prior to any of this happening, I would have thought of them as, you know, really as like, incredibly challenging and difficult, but sort of in practice, regulation, it's taken a huge amount of concentration and work and effort. Like, it hasn't been easy, but it's been straightforward in some senses. Like, a lot of it is about thinking from first principles. What's the right regulation? What's important for the space? How would we get there from here? You know, and then just having conversations, hearing people out, understanding what they need to address for, finding the best ways to address for those. And it's a ton of work, but it's not sort of magic. Like, mostly it is just sort of trying to be thoughtful and reasonable.
And this may feed into that previous question, but what do you think the biggest mistake you've made is?
Yeah, I mean, certainly one big mistake, feeding back to the first piece, was not getting my shit together earlier on, what you when people are unhappy, and would have been a lot of gains to resolving that situation much more promptly than we did. I think that's one piece. I think that, like, in retrospect, we should have probably 6 months to a year earlier than we did started focusing on regulation. I'm still really happy we did it when we did it, but we could have done it earlier. That's maybe a piece of this. And then I think that, like, missing a few really important product things for a little bit too long, or not totally missing them, but underweighting them. I should have emphasized much more strongly than I did the importance of growing out API throughput about, let's say, 15 months ago. That should have been one of our technological priorities, and it was sort of a priority, but it wasn't the single thing we were working the most on, and it should have been much more than it was. So, there are there are a lot of things that we've sort of not handled optimally, and this is certainly one of them.
I know that to decompress, you like playing games. Do you have a favorite game right now, and why that game?
Yeah, so I recently been playing Storybook Book, which is not shocking. It's a game that we acquired. And but it actually came in the opposite direction. Sort of first started playing it, and I think it's a really good game. I think it's a clean game. I think it's something that I can put a lot of thought into if I want to, but that I can also kind of do, with half my brain if I don't mind playing worse. And that's helpful for decompressing sometimes. It's about the right time. I don't want to start a 2-hour long game if I might have to jump back into work much sooner than that. It's it's just sort of a game that I enjoy, and at the same time, obviously there's a little bit of product testing sort of going on in that. So that's what I've been playing the most. Historically, League of Legends is the game that I sort of played the most to decompress.
Right, it makes a lot of sense. If you're playing, you almost feel like you're doing like a product review rather than just play. Yep. Is there something that you thought was super stupid and now you realize was quite valuable, or you've really shifted your perspective around it?
Just in general?
Yeah, just in general, anything that stands out to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that, like, boy, I mean, there are a lot of things that I have, like, way more appreciation for now than I did before. I think that, like, what are sort of some really good examples of this? And just thinking about branding and thinking about like
Hmm.
how you get to a point where customers know who you are and what your company is and what you do. I think it's like really important and valuable and not trivial. And that's definitely something I've like gained more appreciation for. I think just the importance of operations of like, how mechanically you get from point A to point B, uh, is, I think it's really important. I think it's easy to underappreciate that, and to think more about having the right goal and less about, okay, but practically speaking, how do we actually get there, get to that goal? I think that's been sort of, something that I've updated on to some extent. And I I think management is probably the biggest thing. And I'm still very skeptical of what a lot of people call management. I'm very skeptical of sort of management with a capital M, of the hiring managers type of management. And I think it often does more harm than good and creates the problems that it's trying to solve. But it is really important that you show that you set the right standards and for the company, for its employees, that you have good norms of interacting, that you have people in place to provide guidance, and that you manage that while giving people freedom and responsibility, and the ability to actually move forward, not just gumming up the works. It's a delicate balance, but it's just a really, really important one.
Right now in the crypto space, something somewhat surprising is even though the prices are down a lot and volume is down a lot, people are still pretty active. There's still more volume than I expected there would be. People are still building. Are there any things that you think are pretty interesting right now that you're seeing? Can be both on the centralized and decentralized side.
I do think there's a lot of building going on. I mean, part of this is the cliche of like, when you're in a bear market, that's the time to build. And I do think there's just some truth to that. And that is part of what's going on. But I think in terms of the most interesting things that are going on right now, I mean, regulation is a lot of it. Like the space has just been so blocked on regulatory frameworks for so long that, starting to build out that clarity is just central to moving forward as a space. So that is a piece of it. But outside of that, I think like just continuing to refine products to make them better bit by bit, to explore traditional finance and how blockchain can help it grow. And then on the DeFi side, you know, everything is sort of plodding along, right? Like you look at blockchains which are getting faster, more stable over time. You can look at a lot of the exciting things going on in the NFT space, which are I think less around the specific NFTs being issued today, which I think still leave a lot to be desired, but a lot of the infrastructure that's being built out there and sort of reconceptualizing what an NFT could be, what it could represent. And I think working on the payment side, ironing things out. I basically just think that sort of on most of the important sides, there actually is a lot of really valuable work going on in the background, even if it's not necessarily always super visible. And I'm pretty excited for that and for some of that to sort of matriculate, over the next couple years, and go from exciting potential things to exciting actual things.
Totally. Yeah, I was wondering if in the stupid to maybe not so stupid thing you'd put NFTs in, but not yet. We gotta keep building.
Getting close. Yeah, I think making progress.
um, so a couple more questions for you. One of the last ones I have is, what are some things you'd like to see in the world over the next 5 years? Not related to necessarily to crypto or finance, just at a general level, things that would make you happy to see happen.
And we've been through a period of pretty large turmoil, I think, for the world over the last 5 years, and I think that's been true just on many fronts at once. It's been true on the societal side, and you look at how much COVID changed people's lives. It's true on the political side, um, and I would love to see some of that simmer down a little bit and become a little bit more contained, and a little bit less volatile. Um, and I think that yeah, I'd just be excited uh, to see more stability, hopefully balancing stability and innovation, hopefully not resulting in just a sort of like shutdown of new work, but maybe less animosity. Um, and uh, and then obviously it's come with financial turmoil as well. And we've seen a lot of that recently as the world tries to balance inflation with economic growth, and that's not been a trivial thing to do. And so I think you start ironing out a lot of the problems that have started brewing over the last years is probably the thing that I would be most excited to see.
Are there any habits or lessons that you've picked up that you felt have improved your life?
It's a good question. I think that this is a little bit sort of tautological in some ways, but just like taking it really seriously what I do and the decisions that I make, and understanding that they have impact and I'm responsible for that. And I should be doing everything I can to, drive those towards positive impact. And that sort of everything matters. All the decisions that we make matter. Those add up at the end of the day, to, reflect the impact that we have on the world. And I think just thinking about really trying to optimize my life around how it can have impact and how I can, be as effective as I can.
My last question for you, Sam. How much salt is too much salt?
I don't believe in the concept of too much salt. I think too much salt is the amount of salt where it just takes too long to pour it out of the salt shaker and get bored by the end. And you just have to give up and go with what you've got so far. I don't really think there's such a thing as too much beyond
that. Oh, thanks so much for coming on. Glad we did the 3 of 3. Thank you.
Thank you.